If you owe the bank £20,000 and you've got no money, you've got a problem. If you owe that bank £200 million and you've got no money, it's the bank that's got the problem. What I mean is, the more trouble you've managed to get yourself into, the less likely you are to have to pay the price. Not in any way that matters, far less that makes good on all the trouble you've caused. In short, if you're going to screw up, available evidence suggests you might as well screw up on a planet-wide galactic scale, and then no one will be able to reach up high enough to kick your backside for you. Here and abroad, now let me choose my words carefully, the absolute balls up of the official responses to COVID is finally being acknowledged, even if only in the slightest, most insincere way possible, by at least a few of the same people who took to the airwaves round the clock to destroy the careers of colleagues, to defame the critics of their tactics as COVIDiots and granny killers and much, much worse besides. The dam is fractured all over and the truth is leaking out. Even our compliant media, who attempted to paper over the cracks, can't ignore the truth any longer. Last week, the Daily Telegraph newspaper here in the UK carried a front-page headline that read, "Lockdown feared to be killing more than COVID." Quote, "Virus fatalities outstripped by other excess deaths as medics call figures terrifying." Close quote. Terrifying. They've noticed. Also, non-COVID excess deaths averaging 1,000 a week. Quote, "Experts say pandemic delays to treatment for cancer and heart disease are behind the surge." Close quote. Gotta love those experts. Or you might just as usefully point out to Sherlock the absence of excrement. The self-righteous are squirming in their seats across the pond as well. Rochelle Walensky is the director of the Centres for Disease Control, the body that advised the US government throughout and still does. Last week she conceded, "We made some pretty public mistakes and we need to own them." Is that right, Rochelle? The buck stops at your big desk, does it? She went on, "I think it's really important to understand the great work of this agency." Open brackets, pats self on back, closes brackets, but to admit to areas where we needed to improve. We owe that to the American people. Is that the same American people you sought to control, curtail, mask up and jab for 2 years? I would imagine you do owe them that, at least. God love her, Miss Walensky maintained a straight face throughout her presentation. She wasn't alone. Lord of the Wrongs, Anthony Fauci, aka the Chief Medical Officer for the US, accused of funding gain-of-function research in Wuhan, had evidently listened to Rochelle Walensky defending the performance of the CDC and offered. They should be commended, realising and recognising the shortcomings. I'm actually optimistic that given the fact the problems have now been recognised, that there's a pathway to making a very good organisation much better. Dr. Deborah Birx, former White House coronavirus response coordinator, said recently, "I knew these vaccines were not going to protect against infection, and I think we overplayed the vaccine." You think? OK, let's recap. Walensky, Fauci, Birx and the rest assured the US that the vaccines were absolutely safe and as close as imaginable to 100% effective. Misinformation, if there was ever any of the sort. Still, their assessment became the basis for uncounted hundreds of thousands of people being driven from their jobs for refusing to submit to those procedures. Fauci and the rest were all about the lockdowns and the masking. Just look back at the headlines. Here in the UK it was the same. Scientific advisers Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty sang the song of vaccines too. Boris Johnson and Health Secretary Matt Hancock joined in at the chorus, and together with just about every other senior politician, bureaucrat and A-list celeb set about making life as impossible as they could for anyone reluctant to submit to the injection. Anyone warning lockdowns might crash economies. Anyone speaking up for the children and the catastrophic impact of missing school and friends might have on them. All around the developed world it was the same, if not worse, if not even crueler, more draconian. Those people, those most senior of scientists, those high-level politicians and bureaucrats, took possession of the world of before and might as well have crumpled it like old newspaper, soaked it in petrol and set it on fire. There's no going back to what we knew before, because at the fundamental level, down where the building blocks of society are laid, there's only rubble. Uncounted individuals were damaged, pushed to breaking point or into their graves. Couples separated, families were fragmented, communities set at each other's throats. I'm like a cracked record on this. I know it and make no apology, because the extent of the damage done by those who assumed command at the beginning of all this will not be known for years. Do you know people already talk in relation to that cohort of children and young people most affected by lockdown and masking and the rest as the COVID generation? How's that for a tag? Baby boomers, millennials, Gen X, and now the COVID generation. How successfully they shake off that cursed label is anyone's guess. But here's the thing. In this country, with the exception of Hancock, whose resignation was nothing to do with his conduct of the pandemic and everything to do with him having been caught in a compromising position with a lady not his wife, they're still in post. Hancock hasn't even gone away, far from it, still out there holding a candle for Rishi Sunak. Whitty and Valence were both honoured by the Queen for their efforts. The whole bunch of them, those who simply by the exercise of their professionalism helped drive the country off the road and into the abyss of doomed health prognoses and economic disaster, are right where they were or better off than before. Prominent figures in the media who amplified the hate and derision directed at those refusing the jab and questioning lockdown and masks are busily pretending they said no such things. Most of you watching and listening either have jobs or had jobs. Every day we depend upon scores of other people doing their jobs and doing them well, or at least competently. If a tradesman doesn't turn up or doesn't make a decent job of the work in question, you likely won't call on him again. If your food comes cold or inedible in a restaurant, you may well complain. And you yourself, you almost certainly exist in the knowledge that if you mess up at work, really mess up, you'll likely be out on your ear. At the very least, you won't be trousering much of a bonus. That's the reality that's true and unavoidable for millions of us. Cooks, carpenters, plumbers, plasterers, electricians, mechanics, drivers. The list is long. We hold on to our jobs by being competent at the very least, by doing no harm, by meeting the terms of our contracts. And so why does nothing of the same apply to those so much higher up the food chain, those whose jobs make them responsible in whole or in part for the lives of millions of their fellow citizens? These characters at the top of science, of politics, of the civil service, of the NHS, they didn't wire up a plug wrong or burn the top layer of a lasagna. They destroyed lives and wrecked the prospects of nations. Rochelle Walensky of the CDC gets to talk about some pretty public mistakes and to admit to areas where they need to improve. Need to improve? Walensky in the US, others like her here in the UK and across Europe and the wider world, set in train sequences of events that saw to the deliberate creation of two-tier societies, segregation of the clean and the unclean, the good and the bad, the angels and the murderers. Those people and those they inspired set out to drive from society those who would not take the injections. In Austria, it was about fines or imprisonment for refusal, for God's sake. Here in Britain, high-profile figures who I will grudgingly allow to remain nameless, opined that the so-called unjabbed should be locked in their homes or held down in the street and forcibly injected. On account of lockdowns, people lived alone in fear and died alone, cut off from loved ones. Women gave birth alone and were separated from their babies. The dead were disposed of by strangers in empty crematoria from which grieving families were banned. And after 3 years of monumental cock-up, the closest we've got to righting the wrongs are airy acknowledgement of the need to improve. They're having a giraffe. Those people haven't learned anything. The fifth doses of more of the same cocktails are being rolled out across Britain. Far from keeping their heads down, they're capitalising on the ground made, the societal territory taken. Closer than ever now are digital IDs and the replacement of cash with digital currencies controlled by banks and potentially tied to how well we behave, how much we don't criticise those powers that be. The taste they got for lockdowns and other means of control are changing into restrictions they insist are unavoidable if we're to stop the world catching fire on account of climate change. After lockdowns to save the NHS, how about lockdowns to save the world? Not only are they not sorry, they're emboldened to live out more of their fantasies, Net Zero, Agenda 2030. The to-do list, or rather the what we won't be allowed to do list, is seemingly endless. Still, the demonising of those who won't comply goes on. We were ridiculed, insulted, called cranks and conspiracy theorists. We're still under attack for spreading alleged misinformation. Anyone paying attention knows that when it came to safety and efficacy, as well as the logic of lockdowns, it was presidents, prime ministers, politicians, chief medical advisors, the NHS, the CDC, the FDA, and the vast majority of the media that were spreading what it's now clear was misinformation, and they're still doing it. There's a contest running in Britain now, you might have noticed, to appoint a new Prime Minister. It's down to 2. Neither they nor any of the rest of the candidates so much as muttered an apology for unbearable hurt inflicted, lives ruined, prospects sunk without a trace, futures consigned to oblivion on account of policies they either cheerled or turned a blind eye to. A need to improve. No word of apology has there been. Even if there had, sorry is a long way short of being enough. Sorry won't cut it. It seems simple enough to me, but perhaps I should spell it out for the guilty parties. When you screw up this badly, it's time to get your coat and leave. Don't wait to be sacked, because that's clearly not going to happen within your working culture of noblesse oblige, of if you don't scratch out my eyes, I won't scratch out yours. Just finally, this late in the day, after having caused uncountable lifetimes of damage, hurt and heartbreak, find a shred of decency and take a walk.